Hello again everyone from Tokyo, Japan, and welcome back to Japan Vintage Camera. I'm coming to you again today from Aoyama Park next to the Tokyo National Art Center, around the corner from the famous Aoyama National Cemetery, which is famous in Japan anyway, maybe not so famous elsewhere. But it's a nice quiet place to do today's video. And today's video is going to be on one of my favorite film cameras. And I know I've said that before about other cameras which I've described in my videos, but it's especially true for today's camera, the Yashica Electro 35 CCN. In the late 1960s, Yashica's Electro 35 cameras were quite popular. And in order to keep them popular and to give the company something to advertise or add to their sales literature, they reworked their cameras a little bit and they added the N designation to them. The GS became the GSN, the GT became the GTN, and the CC became the CCN. And basically there wasn't really much of a difference between the N model cameras and the earlier cameras. In the case of the GS and GT, the only improvements which they received were the addition of a hot shoe for the flash. Otherwise they were exactly the same. In the case of the CCN, there were some meaningful improvements. The electronics were improved to make the shutter more accurate at lower speeds, and the urethane spacer used in the shutter mechanism was improved and made more resistant to deterioration. So it was a much more reliable camera than the CC, which it replaced. The Yashica CC and CCN were sold almost entirely in the Japanese market, and very few were exported from Japan. In the case of the larger Electro 35 cameras, most of those were exported. And they were designed primarily for the American and European markets, where people were bigger and had bigger hands. The more compact cameras like the GX and CC and CCN were more popular in the Japanese market, where people with smaller hands found them easier to handle and easier to carry. The CC and CCN featured the main strength of the full-size Electro 35 cameras, and that was the electronic brain, or transistor, which operated the electronic shutter. Competing cameras at the time were still using mainly the combination electronic mechanical system, which worked quite well, but was not as precise, or not nearly as precise, as the system used in the Yashica cameras. Minolta, Canon, and Konica cameras were quite good performers, and the metering system was good enough for general use, but it was not really precise enough for, say, getting good results on slide film. Whereas with the Yashica Electro 35 series, the shutter system was precise enough to give outstanding results when using slide film. There were a couple of things which were not quite as good as the full-size Electro cameras, mainly the viewfinder. The CCN, due to its smaller size, did not have parallax correction. However, the viewfinder works quite well. It features illuminated bright line frame lines, which have marks for infinity and close focus. And in my experience shooting these cameras, I've never really had a problem of accidentally leaving something outside the frame. The viewfinder system works quite well. Another limiting factor to the CC and CCN is the maximum shutter speed of around 1/200th of a second, which the shutter speed is kind of slow because the large aperture which these cameras came with, the large opening in the shutter, that kind of limited the maximum shutter speed. So these cameras are, you can't really use them shooting at wide apertures in daylight scenes unless you use a neutral density filter. If you're serious about photography and you shoot in a lot of situations, you should have some neutral density filters on hand. On the positive side, the CC and CCN use a 52mm filter size, which is the Nikon size. So filters of any kind are really, really easy to find for these. A big improvement over the full-size Electro 35s, speaking of the filter, is that the light meter window is moved inside the filter ring, so you can easily use any kind of filter and not have to compensate with it by compensate for it by having to set a different film speed or whatever, as you have to do in the full-size Electro cameras. Let's go ahead and take a look at the features and functions of the Electro 35 CCN, and everything I say about the CCN applies to the CC. Starting at the top, we have the film rewind knob, and we have the shoe to mount your flash gun. If you're mounting a flash on this camera, you have to plug it in using the sync cord to the socket here on the left side. Here we have the shutter release button, and it's surrounded by a lock switch which you can turn, and this prevents you from accidentally firing the shutter when you're putting the camera in the bag or otherwise handling the camera. Here we have the film winding and shutter cocking lever, and here we have the film counter window. On the back here we have, of course, the viewfinder window. We have the cap, which covers the battery chamber, and then we have this red button, which is the battery check lamp, very similar to on the full-size Electro cameras. And just like the full-size Electro cameras, when you press down on the check switch, the green light should illuminate inside the film counter window. On the front of the camera we have the controls for the aperture and of course the focus, which makes it the same as the other Yashica Electro 35 cameras. On the bottom we have the release button, which releases the film winding mechanism and allows you to rewind the film. And we have the 1/4 inch tripod socket. The main strength of the CC and CCN cameras, and the main selling point, and what made them very popular with international shooters, was the 35mm f1.8 lens, which was the fastest 35mm lens available in a fixed lens rangefinder camera. And this makes the Yashica CC and CCN very well suited for indoor photography or situations where there isn't much light. A bad thing about the fast lens is the aperture system uses only 2 blades. That's in order to simplify the shutter mechanism to fit everything in the compact space. And the effect this has is on the bokeh in the images. If you're shooting images which have small highlights in the background, you get this effect which is called bat wing bokeh. And most people really wouldn't notice it unless they were looking for it or you pointed it out to them. You don't have like the soft round circles or donut shapes in the light. You have these kind of funny bat wing shapes or seagull shapes, however, whatever you prefer, bats or seagulls. When you're shooting at wide apertures or with the camera fully open, of course you get none of that. But it is there, and yeah, I don't have any complaints about it. I like how the camera shoots. The CC and CCN are my favorite street photography cameras. I love them because they're very compact. The viewfinder system is quite well suited to street photography. The simple lines is quite easy to compose your subject inside the viewfinder. And the electronic shutter is very, very quiet, even quieter than a Leica or other rangefinder cameras. It's really, really nice. And everything is very smooth. The Aperture priority auto exposure system is very simple to use. You just select the aperture that you want for the available light or for the effect you want, and the camera automatically chooses a very accurate shutter speed. When you're firing the camera and you look inside, when you press the shutter button, there are 2 warning lights. If the red light comes on, it means that there's too much light and the shutter speed cannot go fast enough to get an accurate exposure. So you have to close down the aperture a little bit until the light goes out. If the shutter speed is set too slow or closed too much and the shutter speed is too slow, then you get a yellow lamp or yellow pointer lamp. And this means that you should open up the aperture a little bit. The minimum shutter speed in CC or CCN is either 8 seconds or 16 seconds. 8 seconds in the CCN and 16 seconds in the CC. So you don't really have to worry much about shooting at smaller apertures unless you're shooting handheld. Then you might get a little bit of blur, and that's mainly what the warning lamp is telling you, that you have to be careful or the image is going to blur unless you hold the camera very steady or using a tripod. If you're using a tripod, luckily the CC and CCN come with will accept the standard cable release. I really like these cameras, and I remember when I was like doing someone told me that like the lens, like the Canon 35 f2 lens had like a thorium radioactive glass in it. And I did a test with a Geiger counter at the emergency center, and sure enough, it was ticking. And then I found out that the rear elements in the CCN and CC cameras also had thorium glass, which was pretty cool, because I was able to get them to tick as well. Particularly in the CC cameras. If you get a CC camera, it's possible for the rear element to become a little gold or yellow over time. And this is good and bad. It's good in that it adds contrast when you're shooting black and white film, and it makes color film a little bit warmer. But if the gold becomes too pronounced, it can alter the accuracy of the exposure a little bit. It can cut off just a little bit of the light, not a whole lot, but but it does. But you can get rid of the yellowing in the glass by just exposing it to sunlight. Just open the film door and set the camera so the sun shines on the lens, and the yellow will come out and the glass will clean up, just like it does in the other thorium glass cameras. Anyway, that's it for my video about the Yashica CC and CCN. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comment section below. If you're interested in seeing more videos about vintage Japanese cameras, please subscribe, and I'll be putting up more videos shortly. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you come back.